Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Logos for episode 41 of the Church Fathers. As a sort of, I probably should have started with this at the beginning of the Hortatory address to the Greeks, but if anybody still remembers when we started Justin many months ago, I did discuss briefly some of the scholarly dispute that the translator mentioned. Now, this is over 100 years ago, the 1880s. So there were those works which were indisputably attributed to Justin. There were those which were disputed. Some thought Justin wrote them, some thought he didn't. And then those which were spurious. And I think the ones that were not debated and still are not debated are the first and second apology and the dialogue with Trypho. I think what this and then the rest of these fragments here are in the disputed category. But modern day scholarship does not believe this was written by Justin. They call the author the pseudo Justin. So, and one of the things that happened in antiquity was people would write not under a false name in order to give credibility to what they were writing. So, for example, there's the 5th and 6th century author, the pseudo Dionysius, who takes the name from one of Paul's first converts in Greece in order to give his Neoplatonic teachings weight they wouldn't otherwise have had in the Christian context. So, since that was a common habit, it's not unsurprising that this was done with the pseudo Justin. And one of the things that they point out, modern scholarship, is that this Justin is hostile to Greek philosophy. And in the Apology, Justin said that Plato was, basically a proto-Christian, dying for the truth when he drank the hemlock. So that was the biggest argument that was produced. But one thing that I think could be argued in favor of this still being Justin is, like Justin in the dialogue with Trypho, he's willing to state a fact incorrectly and then make a huge argument based on it. So in the dialogue with Trypho, it was misstating a passage from Ezekiel, imposing Jacob rather than Job. And if it was quoted correctly, many of his arguments about Jacob just would fall on their face. And here it's the Diodorus Siculus is misquoted as saying that the Egyptians learned from Moses, which is actually, I think, something that Josephus mentions, but of course the Greeks wouldn't mention Josephus. So I guess just as a sort of like parameter for this work, Logos, what do you think about what's been said so far?
We were talking about this a little bit before stream, but a couple of things have struck me so far. First, almost no mention of Jesus specifically, the New Testament, and so on has really happened here. The vast majority of what's been said are just things like, here's why Greek thought comes from the Old Testament. It's all attributed to Moses, the prophets, the Old Testament prophets anyway, and so on. So if he's trying to convert the Greeks to Christianity, which he seems to do in some of his monologues later on, where he, wants them to convert and whatnot, it seems he's going to have to go a long way to converting them. The other thing I find interesting is that he's really attacking them. Well, I talked about this last time, where he talks about how these philosophers contradict themselves to each other. They're not to be trusted. The oracles aren't to be trusted. And now he's going to spend a whole lot of time. So last time he talked about Homer and stuff like that and how they actually reference the Old Testament. This time he's going to spend most of his time talking about Plato and how he references the Old Testament. And so I have to, bring this back for the audience. Maybe they didn't watch the last one. It's really weird that he goes on this diatribe about how you can't trust Plato, you can't trust Aristotle. They're contradictory, schemers. They contradict themselves to each other. And he's going to have these whole 10 chapters dedicated to, but here's why Plato, was based actually and actually believed all this Old Testament stuff. It's like, well, is Plato contradicting himself and talking at both sides of his mouth? Or is Plato actually this secretly based Old Testament, scribe who just didn't reveal his power level? He can't have that one both ways. So that was something that was also interesting. I think that's everything I wanted to say about that. We'll get to the particulars about Plato later.
Okay, yeah. So again, we'll get to it when we get to it, but he does sort of resolve this tension. I guess we'll leave it up to you, the viewer, and you, Logos, to see if you appreciate the resolution. But chapter 21, Justin says God cannot be given a name. He is the nameless, hence taking the title I am. Satan tempted Eve by saying that she would be as God. Even though the gods are nothing, they are no gods but God. God also needs to show the Israelites first so that he is the only existing being. Well, I'm going to start right here because this is weird. Because like God does have a name. Like God, in the Old Testament, since this is what we're being used here, he is given a name. He gives himself a name, right? The idea is that man doesn't. God names Jacob, so right, rather than man naming God, it's God naming man. But it's just strange to me that he'd say that God does not give Jacob a name. Does not give himself a name, because I believe when Jacob wrestles with God, he gets a name. Or no, that's when Jacob gets the name. Let's see. I'll have to look that up later, because there are names given in the Hebrew, like there's El Shaddai, which is a name for God. So that to me is a little strange. Moving on. We're going to go to 22. Plato learned in Egypt there was only one God, but did not mention Moses because it was unsafe. Plato dreaded the Areopagus. In the Timaeus, Plato argues that God is self-existing without generation. Justin hinges on the difference of an article, which versus who. Moses said he is he who is. Plato said that which is. My comments are, this is a big difference. Who implies a person, that a thing or a principle. Which so you can't make that connection, because who implies a person, that implies a thing or a principle. Plato says this principle is unbegotten. The gods that were made by the uncreated principle cannot be born or die. That unbegotten principle cannot. This principle is the fashioner of the gods. So here we go. Timaeus, you've got some stuff to say, no doubt, Logos.
Yeah, I think this is an incomplete view of Plato. And I think to see it, you really have to read the Phaedo to put some pieces together. Maybe this could just be my bias. I think the Phaedo is my favorite work by Plato and illustrates, I think, the interconnectivity of his thought for a lot of things. And so you can't really understand what Plato's talking about here without taking the paradoxes he was pointing out in there on board. So, for example, when we were doing our Plato stream and we talked about the soul, and there's two different arguments that Plato made in parallel about the soul's immortality. But both arguments were in some sense incongruent with each other because they're talking about the soul being immortal in fundamentally different senses. The latter treated the soul like an abstracta, like a musical note, a form of a chorus, and had no causal activity without the stroking of a harp, say. Treated the soul like a number, but such a thing was causally inert. It didn't come to be out of its opposites. So in some sense, it's ungenerated, but the implication of Plato's argument is that the soul doesn't causally affect anything, but requires something like a harp, metaphorically speaking, to bring anything about it into being at all. Now, that's the sense, I think, in which Plato is talking about God in this part of the Timaeus. Sure, God's ungenerated, but if you look at the way that Plato treats ungenerated things, they're not the type of things that causally act in and of themselves. And this is why in the Timaeus, for example, it's the demiurges that do the causal work. Zeus is the demiurge of lightning. He is the maximal form of lightning. So God isn't making lightning happen on Earth, and instead Zeus is doing it. You can call it whatever you want. The maximal Platonic form of lightning that's instangible is doing all the work. God isn't really doing any causal stuff at all. And so Justin has to be very careful here, because insofar as he's leaning on God's being ungenerated, that comes to a whole lot of baggage in Platonic philosophy that I don't think Christians would accept, and he's not telling that half of the story.
Right. But also, I'd like to get your thought on the pronoun difference, who and that, because that's actually huge. Like, that does not equate to who, and to make the connection that Plato is saying what Moses said, that doesn't follow at all.
Exactly. And sorry, I was kind of making this indirectly. So there's two arguments in the Phaedo, right? One's immortality of the soul treats it like an abstracta, which is like the form of any person in general. And so when Plato is talking about that which, he's talking about a second argument of the soul. A soul is a that which is in principle abstract in all people, which makes them alive, makes them in the cycle, and so on. But if you want to talk about a particular person's soul, a who, this is a generative thing for Plato. You come to life just as you come to die. You are trapped in the cycle of dying and coming alive, which fuels Platonic recollection. It also explains your personality. it also it attempts to explain a whole lot about you. The body is a prison, temptation, philosophy is the art of dying and staying dead. All that is kind of bundled with a Platonic discussion of who. There is no who fully without recollection in some sense. And so it requires some sort of generative thing. This is a minor slip of the tongue. The who versus the that, especially in the Phaedo, is a massive chasm of difference in Plato that can't be swept under the rug.
Yeah, exactly. It's massively different. Okay, so 23. Plato contradicts himself. Plato is unwilling to abandon polytheism and says that the maker fashioned the gods. Plato makes his concession out of fear. Everything that is made is perishable, but also the gods are made and are imperishable. The intervention of the maker makes the gods imperishable. Matter cannot be controlled by necessity. Okay, 24. Plato banishes Homer from his Republic, yet Homer, through Phoenix, tells Achilles that the gods are not inflexible. This was not said of the maker, but of the gods themselves. Justin argues that Ulysses says Homer trusts not in the men or gods, he is trusting in the one true God, and the other gods are no gods. And I argue that's a stretch that doesn't follow. He himself signifies the unbegotten God. Only the Chaldeans and Hebrews found wisdom. So first of all, this entire quote I think is entirely spurious. I don't know of any classical source that says this or any poem. I think that's just spurious for the sake of this attempt at proselytizing the Greeks. I would argue that. So his argument is that Plato is contradicting himself because he's afraid to scare the pagans, the polytheists. So he's secretly based in those Moses, but sort of like hides his power level by working the gods into it in order to not get the people to have blowback against them. And then again, the strange reading of Homer. I mean, Zeus is the high god, so of course giving Zeus this sort of like preferential treatment doesn't necessarily imply that the other gods aren't gods, especially since Ulysses in the Odyssey, since we're going to be using Homer here, does invoke the name of the other gods, specifically Athena and Apollo, to return home. So I mean, he does believe these are real beings. So I don't think you can read Homer that way. Okay, Logos.
Yeah, the only thing I really have to say about this, I'll note that chapter 23 I probably read like 2 or 3 times. I still don't fully understand what Justin is trying to say there. But as far as chapter 24, it strikes me that if you want to make a Platonic argument for monotheism, you'd probably spend 5 chapters carefully talking about the Euthyphro dilemma. Because if there's any argument that Plato makes for monotheism, that's basically it. The idea that if there are gods, they have to quarrel amongst each other. It's even more than like there must be one maximal god that takes precedence, because here's the problem. Just because Zeus is the highest god doesn't mean you can't anger the others and face massive consequences. So if you have these gods that demand rituals of you, the best the Greeks could do is say, well, we'll prioritize those that will get us in the least trouble if we anger the gods or something. But Plato was making a much more principled argument than that, rather than a practical argument. Like, he almost puts justice itself in tension with trying to ameliorate those concerns. And so I think if he would have done that instead of doing this weird Republic Homer thing, he probably would have had a more interesting argument. But I'm just not following any of this.
I know it's kind of all over the place. I agree. 25. Why does Plato object to Homer, saying the gods are inflexible? This is a good intuition, for if the divinity is flexible, then why would a man repent of his sins, since sin might sometime in the future be found acceptable to the divine? Plato alternatively calls the gods mortal and immortal. Plato seems to allow for the maker being changeable. Plato was fearful of the polytheists in Athens, so he proposed these contradictions. He communicated with the learned men from Moses in Egypt, but in an incomplete style, lacking the mystical understanding. By appealing to old tradition, Justin argues Plato is referring to Moses. He again falsely cites Diodorus, whom he claims stated Moses was the first of all lawgivers. Okay, so this is interesting, right? Chapter 25. Because so much of this is clearly just wrong. And I think the key thing to zero in on here is, where does he say that? 5. He says, Here we go. And therefore, when Plato wished, as it were, to interpret to the uninitiated that had been mystically expressed by the participle concerning the eternality of God. See, this is the calling card of the Alexandrians, where they introduced all
Yes.
this, like, allegorical woo-woo. So when they say mystical, what that means is carte blanche to invent facts. We saw
Yeah.
this with Barnabas. We saw this with the pseudo Barnabas, rather, with some of his really bizarre allegorical readings of Moses' food laws. And we also saw this with, more recently, I think some of Justin, some of the more non-disputed Justin, but maybe it wasn't Ignatius, but he didn't really appeal to mystic tradition, though. So I think, to me, this is probably the strong evidence that this is the pseudo Justin, because the Justin that we read in the dialogue with Trypho and the two apologies does not refer to any mystical intuition.
Yeah, I agree.
But anything about 25 that you wanted to say?
No, this is more a Homer thing, and I haven't read any of Homer, so I don't have much to contribute here.
Okay, 26. In order to prove that Plato knew of Moses, Justin refers to a passage where Plato speaks of one beloved by God. Who else could this be but Moses? Justin argues that in the first book of the Republic, Plato restates the doctrine of the judgment he first heard from Moses. Well, first of all, the idea beloved of God, that would refer to Moses, that's going to convince no Greek ever. That's so obviously a forced reading of what Plato's saying. It's so bad. I mean, I don't know what Greek he's expecting to be like, oh, wow, yeah, I'm going to be convinced of whatever you're arguing for. Now, there's a bit of the Republic, he says, it deals with the doctrine of the judgment. Like, I guess the Jewish Christian concept of the judgment. But you've read part of the Republic, right, Logos? What are your thoughts on that?
I read the very, very beginning, but the Republic is another one that I've never read from beginning to end because there's like a bajillion volumes and it's super long. So I'll have to put this on the table and get back to it.
Yeah, fair enough. 27. Justin appeals to Book 10 of the Republic as further evidence of the knowledge of the judgment. Plato hides this to avoid the persecution of the Greeks. Plato here seems to argue that the body and soul are judged. For why would Plato write about the punishment of Adrius being of corporeal nature if that man's body were left on earth when his soul was in Hades? Plato was familiar with the prophets of Israel through Egypt. Okay, been over this already a lot. 28. Not only Plato, but Homer received the same knowledge from Egypt. How could the liver be eaten if there was no body? Its soul does not have a liver. Again, a false appeal to Diodorus. Some reference is made to a potion brewed by Helen of Sparta to make a connection to Moses. That was bizarre. The Garden of Alcianus is the Garden of Eden. The poem of Odious and Ephialtes is the Tower of Babel. Vulcan had the image of creation emblazoned on the shield of Achilles. The goddess Ate is equated with the Christian devil. Again, this is a lot of weird allegorism, which we already know he's going to appeal to implicitly from the beginning of this by saying that Plato's the secretly based guy that's hiding his power level, and then his actual appeal to mystic tradition. But you see, this is the problem we have. Like, with mystic tradition, you end up with this word salad. Like, what does this actually amount to, Logos?
Now, what I find interesting about this is some of these connections he's making between the myths are the exact same connections that a movie like Zeitgeist would try to make to undermine Judaism, Christianity, whatever. It's all the same myths repackaged. And there's some sense in which Christianity and whatnot have tried to say that no, we're different than them. See, we have this, and this. They didn't have that. Here's what's unique to our thing. But this guy's insistence on trying to like merge the Old Testament like into founding Greek myths, it's almost like a way to undermine that project. It's just bizarre.
It is strange. It is strange. 29. When Plato said that the third original principle next to God and matter is form, and he's claiming he got this from Moses. Moses did not use the term form, but with a mystic understanding, one can find it. When Moses said that the tabernacle ought to be made after the pattern God gave Moses, he is speaking of form. Okay, so let's find this mystic reference again. This is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. Here we go. but not having at the same time been instructed by the initiated that without mystic insight, it is impossible to have any distinct knowledge of the writings of Moses. So, like, this is actually kind of a bizarre parallel history the pseudo Justin is developing here. One, the Egyptians' laws come from Moses. So rather than being like the great enemy of Israel in the Bible, which is what Egypt is, and Moses rejected the wisdom of the Egyptians, Moses is the author of the wisdom of the Egyptians. And all these like hierophants from Egypt that are initiates are like the truth, I guess, truly knowledgeable about Moses, communicated this to Homer and Plato and whoever else. I mean, this is just frankly bizarre.
Wait. Alexandria was in Egypt, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that makes a whole lot of sense.
But like, I mean, if you take what this guy is saying, this is a bizarre reading of history and of the Bible.
It is. Basically what this is you have this Christian sect in Alexandria that wants to be increasingly relevant because you have Christ in Jerusalem, you have Rome, which is one of the bigger churches at the time, I reckon. You've got these Christians in Alexandria trying to like come into play here. And so they're trying, it sounds to me, to make this argument that Egypt and their cultural heritage is of more importance to the Christian faith to kind of get them in than a straightforward reading of the Bible. Basically, Todd, this is like We Was Kings before there was We Was Kings.
Yeah. Well, because again, it's totally bizarre, right? Because in the Bible, Moses rejects the teaching of the Egyptians, but if he's the author of that teaching, what does that even mean?
Well, yeah, exactly. So they have to bend the history to say that, well, I mean, Egypt totally gave it to Moses. He rejected some, it was nonsense what Moses did. He gave it to Egypt. Egypt gave it. We parted ways amicably. What's the problem? Alexandria has always been based.
Yeah, and not only that, when in the apology, when Justin was writing about the Christians and what they actually practiced in order to convince the Romans that they weren't doing all these horribly outre things that they were being accused of, he doesn't mention the idea of like the secret elite with mystic knowledge. That never came up.
Yeah, it's true.
So again, probably strong evidence that this is the pseudo Justin, as modern scholarship has since agreed.
Yep.
Okay, lastly, for today, 30. Plato thought the earth was pre-existing, even though Moses said it was created. The earth was according to a pre-existing form which God had. The form of earth and man existed before either were made. Man is made of clay. Homer agrees. Homer got this information from Egypt. Okay, again, we've covered a lot of these main points that are wrong. I think the interesting thing here, though, is that nothing that we've read in here indicates the author's a Christian. It could have been a Jew, because no mention of Christ, no mention of a Messiah, no mention of a second person of the Godhead, which, by the way, was a huge part of the dialogue with Trypho. The God that Jacob wrestled with, the God that appeared in the burning bush, but was seen rather than the unseen God. So no mention of that is made. I mean, this sounds like a Platonic Jew, not a Christian.
Yeah. And what's also interesting, too, is here's another reason why this can backfire on him. If he succeeds in kind of integrating Jewish canon, which is basically what this is, into the Greek myths and saying, well, if you just interpret your Greek myths accurately, you end up with this kind of quasi-Jewish interpretation. What's to stop the Greeks from going, oh, well, I mean, you make a good point, Justin. It sounds like our myths are probably saying roughly the same thing you're saying. I'm going to nod and agree and just keep doing what I was already doing.
Well, yeah. Now, on the one hand, whoever this guy is does have a fairly sophisticated philosophy of his own.
Yeah.
Which sounds a lot more Platonic than the Plato, than the Justin we got at the beginning of the dialogue with Trypho.
Yeah, it does. That's definitely true.
He sounds a lot more Platonic, but he doesn't even sound like a Christian, though. This could all just be given how Moses was dismissed out of hand so often in the dialogue with Trypho, it is difficult to see this as Justin, because Moses here is like doing a lot of work
Yeah, definitely.
in this reading. But whether this was a Christian or a Jew, whoever he was clearly Neoplatonic. Clearly had just a complete, a fanfic version of history, where like the Egyptian priesthood were totally bros with Moses, and they had all the secret knowledge they were passing on to the Greeks. I mean, wow, this just turns everything on its head. I don't know what to say, Logos.
Neither do I.
All right, everyone, that's all for tonight. Unless there's anything else you want to add, Logos.
No, I did find that quip about the tabernacle really, really interesting, though. Where was it?
It was in
Plato
20.
then, yeah, 29. Plato then, reading these passages and not receiving what was written with the suitable insight, thought that form had some kind of separate existence before that which the senses perceive. Now,
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say it sounds like the author's an Aristotelian.
that's where I saw too. Like, hold on a second. That's you don't have to misinterpret an Old Testament passage to get this idea. The example I always use is of the computer, right? Oh, what you doing in your garage? Oh, inventing a thing. What thing you inventing? I'm inventing a computer. What's a computer? What's a thing I haven't invented yet? Well, we can't talk about the forms of things until after we perceive them from the senses. So you're really doing nothing at all. Now come back to me when this new thing out of nowhere exists called a computer. Right? Like, there's plenty of reason to think that you could get this idea of forms as things you're tapping into and discovering and inventing this whole math as discovered paradigm from a reading of the Old Testament. I know so many people who come to the same conclusions that ever touching the Old Testament or seeing anything about these verses. The stretch here is just I just chuckled a lot when I read that. So that's my final thing I noticed, I guess.
So we have a couple people in the chat. Hello to GF, Richard Ricker Deepness, and Seamus O'Blaine. He has a few things that are relevant, I think. Gaelic histories have a tendency to fabricate connections to Spain and the biblical Hebrew world in the medieval period. Even today, many Irish believe the Spanish are our closest genetic relatives, not the British or the Dutch, believe it or not. So, okay, I have to say this. This will probably be a theme for a future video at some point. The thing that I find to be really sad and just unfortunately true is if you look at like classical history, the great pagan historians Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Xenophon, who are Greek, and then the Romans, like Livy, Suetonius, and others, they are, I think, broadly accurate. Like, I mean, they might be wrong in some particulars, but it's not like a clear fabrication. It's not like a obviously fabricated thing like we just read about Diodorus being, which is a clear fabrication of what he said. These sort of like later Christian authors, whether they're doing church history or history, just fabricate stuff out of whole cloth. It's crazy. And it's sad that these people are actually probably less trustworthy than the pagans that came before them. It's not something I want to say, but where you can, double check the source material, it's pretty obvious. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, Logo. So what do you think that entails, if anything?
Which part? There's a lot there.
Oh, the fact that basically classical pagans were more trustworthy in truth telling with their history than later Christian authors.
I think it just goes back to I wouldn't put any special thing on it. I would say that you have to look at the motivations of any author for anything. And if people write with sufficient motivation, they can bend things a bit. So like looking at this work, it seems to be that this is the work of an Alexandrian trying to spin an address to the Greeks that, as some tertiary objective seems to be to integrate like Alexandria and Egypt within the broader Judeo Old Testament framework to make it more relevant to Christianity. And you could just see it by what we've talked about and how he's doing this. I wouldn't say that's a Christian thing or a pagan thing or anything like that. I think different authors have their own axes to grind, and you can kind of figure it out through their work if you read it carefully. So,
yeah. All right, everyone. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.